conclusion of Bürgermeisters and Geschichtes requires a title that only my mother would use. Like many families, we had our differences and squabbles. And like the 10 tribes of Israel, there was always a wise person who acted the part of judge and jury. Of course, you realize the 10 issues of Kaplan's had its mediator, whose magic words were Sengenug. It was enough to end, at least temporarily, any family squabble. The literal translation of Sengenug is enough is enough. Therefore, the title to this concluding saga of the early tribe of 10 Kaplans is Enough is Enough. Somehow, these words have a certain amount of class in its sound. My brothers and sisters were left with a legacy in being able to use many of the Jewish expressions that we learned from our parents. I'm sure that many of you will always continue to include in your lexicon an expression that you learned from your parents. Should you notice some hesitancy in my voice, it is due to my diminishing eyesight, as I have some difficulty reading my notes. My ophthalmologist tells me that after my cataracts are removed, this problem will be solved. Incidentally, I am also blessed with a hearing loss. Now I have a complete set. So far, what I have said is just a prologue before my dramatic conclusion of Enough is Enough. I hope that the English majors or the many college graduates of the family will forgive and overlook the syntax of this narrative. If this was submitted to a book reviewer, I would have been criticized for my failure to systematically arrange the details in a more orderly way. I'm not seeking a Pulitzer Prize for literature, but rather a smile, a laugh or two, or perhaps a respectable snicker will do. Throughout these tapes, I have tried to avoid any display of emotion or sentiment. We have had our share of both. Of course, you realize that the acclaim from my 2 previous tapes of Geschichtes and Bürgermeisters was well received by the public, i.e. the Kaplans. I decided against any other publication for fear that the IRS would insist that all royalties be accounted for. Other than the Kaplans, the publication of these tapes would have been received with as much enthusiasm as the advent of a haddock at the Fulton Fish Market. I hope I am not repeating myself about the good old days. All my brothers and sisters will never forget our home, which was not exactly a model for Tara, but it consisted of many rooms in a tenement building. Our lavish living and sleeping quarters usually consisted of 2 beds. I'm not sure whether they were king or queen size. All I can say is that the three boys would sleep in one bed. Both ends of the bed were quickly occupied. The one in the middle became part of a human sandwich that was there was always a tug of war for the sheet covers. I believe that we had the first indoor pool. Boy, oh boy, did it fill up after a heavy downpour. Who will forget the black stove in the kitchen? This at first was our only and main source of heat. Part of our early chores was breaking up the wooden fish boxes to be used for the stove. Coal was used, and the ashes were sifted to bank the fire, and part of the ashes was spread around the sidewalks to prevent us from slipping on the ice. Who will forget the big copper boiler on the stove? Dirty clothes were in the boiler before they were washed and hung up on a long outdoor clothesline. One day, while the boiler was being moved, it fell on Helen's legs, which bore the scars of the accident for the rest of her life. Our good old days had unpaved roads and lots of horses and wagons, ruts were digging up the muddy streets. Evidence that the horses had been there was obvious. The wooden floors of our home was constantly being washed and scrubbed by my sisters. Papers were spread throughout the floors. On occasion, the muddy footprints of my brothers were visible, and all hell would break loose. Eventually, the linoleum was installed, and all scrubbing of the wooden floors came to a happy end. Another bit of class was added when carpeting was installed. I don't believe that we had wall-to-wall carpeting. Otherwise, and my brother Albert would have been unable to have a suitable depository to hide his money. I referred earlier to Albert's being the originator of branch banking. He had his money all over the house. My father, as with many other men, was not the domineering person of the family. Most of the men that I knew were literate, but untrained in any trade. It seems that the men that I knew who came from Russia had parents who were rabbis. I think we could have used a few more entrepreneurs. My father took all his instructions from my mother. He always followed her instructions. I shall always remember my father's one tooth in his mouth. For many years, my mother tried to get him to go to the dentist for some dentures. He always refused to go. My mother would always prepare the food for my father's lone tooth. For years, I refer to my father as having a mouthful of tooth. Let's discuss a subject of great importance. With a family of 10 children, how did Mama keep track of our birthdays? Calendars were available and were given away around Christmas time. My mother never used a calendar to recall our birthdays, but she did associate our birthdays with some event, holiday, or a date of the Jewish month. My birthday was a certain day of the Jewish month of Tammuz, which generally falls in July. Bert Gibbs, I believe, was born on the 8th candle of Hanukkah. Fortunately, our birthdays were registered at the City Hall by the doctor. I would have hated to tell my first grade teacher that I was born on a certain day of Tammuz. I never did ask who gave us our names. I assumed that as a child was born, a name was decided on by my older brothers and sisters. I don't recall discussing the importance of immunization. I recall my mother taking a group of my brothers and sisters to the Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston. There we would get our necessary shots. I don't know why we went to Boston instead of to a local doctor's office. It must have been free at the hospital. And quality medicine was practiced by my mother. The doctor was called only when a child was ready for delivery. My mother was a good customer. The back of my mother's hand on one's forehead was indicative if an ailment existed. The usual medication was a dose of castor oil. Normie, I enjoyed your recent essay about Ellis Island. It was enlightening to follow in your footsteps the trials and tribulations of my mother, Ben and Shirley, when they sailed from Russia to this country. I tried to obtain a more complete history of the early arrival days when I was visiting the Norman Church in Utah. I tried to obtain information from the Department of Immigration and Naturalization. Not having enough facts about the arrival ship and dates, I was unsuccessful in obtaining the necessary information. Perhaps this information will be in the possession of one of the family members. For years, my sister Shirley would mention that we should record the history of the family. Shirley, I'm trying to comply with your wishes. Earlier, I mentioned that I was not going to get emotional or sentimental in this report. However, these feelings are as part of our lives as the many years of nachas that we enjoyed. The original tribe of 10 Kaplans is now down to 5. of of the first generation of brothers and sisters. Hopefully, we shall have many more years of health and happiness, that our children and their children will always remember their heritage and take great pride in being a member of the Kaplan family.